I will never insert an advertisement here, but I am willing to tell you about the product for money. I've never had an eye for new smartphones, but now I'm going to record a quality tech review. I will never recommend you some shady scamish service, but I genuinely think this NFT thingy is the future of crypto. What would you call such a person? A madman? Trickster? Bipolar? But when a complex entity such as the state behaves in the same way, everything seems to be in order. This is where politics comes in, aspects of which are difficult to grasp. On top of that, if you only pay attention to one aspect, you end up with not just a one-sided view, but an outright false view. For instance, how can one answer the question, is China an ally of Russia? There are two camps to try to keep your foot in. In one of them it says, security of one country should not come at the expense of the security of other countries. Still less should regional security be guaranteed by strengthening or even expanding military blocs. We encourage the US, the NATO and the EU to engage in equal-footed dialogue with Russia. Pay attention to the negative impact of NATO's continuous eastward expansion on Russia's security. Alright, I hear you. China's with us. Russian troop presence in some regions of Ukraine is not an invasion, but we are calling to prevent any further escalation. They're right. They are right. Friendship with Russia is rock solid. Our man Z. But as they say, good words without deeds are rushes and reeds. So let's take a look at what's happened. The Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank has decided to put all activities relating to Russia and Belarus on hold. Two of China's largest state-owned banks have restricted financing for purchases of Russian commodities. China has refused to supply aircraft parts after sanctions. China has cut smartphone shipments to Russia by at least half. Sinopec has suspended the discussions to invest up to $500 million in the new gas chemical facility in Russia. And let's add even more statements, all from the same China, though they are somewhat different from the previous ones. Xi Jinping, in a conversation with Biden, noted that the US and China must not only guide their relations forward along the right track, but also shoulder their share of international responsibilities, whatever that means. Chinese ambassador to Ukraine, Fan Zhangrong, said that China will forever be a good force for Ukraine, both economically and politically, and it will respect the path chosen by Ukrainians. And if you think China is shifting its ground, no. In fact, it is a quite consistent policy which China has always stood by. It hasn't shifted its ground. It hasn't been in favor firstly and then changed its mind against it. No, both in favor and against it go hand in hand. The East is a delicate matter, and now we are going to examine the position of the Eastern Empire, which is incomprehensible to people from the Western culture, to which you and I belong, by the way. First, let's start with an example we can all understand. Why are you friends with one person or another? You mostly need the person for acquiring helpful connections, providing security, providing leisure time. And if you are like, what a mercantile idea is that? That lad and me, we're friends. It's interesting to spend time with him. Well, interest is exactly about providing leisure time, and supporting each other is about security. In short, as people in reality do not become friends just because, neither do entire nations. So, the strength of friendship among states depends very much on the economy. That is, the more countries exchange goods with each other, the more genuine their friendship is. In that sense, it is quite smart to view countries as corporations, where the basis of developed countries is about boring economics, and only on top of that comes the fun and accessible to the masses PR campaign. Every country has its own campaign. Somewhere they need to plant democracy in territories so fortunate to possess oil, and somewhere they need to unite the great country. In dictatorships, though, PR campaigns suck ass, because the dictator is good at enforcing, but totally awful at PR.
What the fuck?
We see this in the already becoming a meme denazification and demilitarization with which Putin has begun justifying his war. Those countries that are past the stage of personal dictatorship pay a lot of attention to the economy. Obviously, any system in general thinks only about how to preserve itself, but some are at a stage of development when the economic well-being of the population comes to the forefront, though in some states power can still be retained with a gentle baton smack to the head. Just remember how the US started banning Huawei and then used it as a leverage to adjust the trade balance. The discontent started back in 2016 when Trump was just campaigning. Even then he was calling China a rapist of the US economy. It turned out that China was buying $179 billion worth of goods from the US, when the US itself was buying $557 billion from China. So there was a $378 billion injustice. Well, to put it properly, it was a trade deficit. Here, we need to recognize the importance of trade volume. In other words, how much one country sells to another and how much it buys. And now, with all due understanding, we can just take a look at how much China sells and where to. So, China sells $51 billion worth of goods to Russia. That sounds impressive. I, for instance, have never touched such a sum in person, but such volumes can be compared to France and the UK. To Germany alone, China sells $112 billion worth of goods. And, the cherry on top, to the main external enemy of Russia, the US, $438 billion. If you compare it with Russia, the sales to the US alone are 9 times higher. If you add a couple of Western countries to the US, then you get a shitload of money, which is quite scary for China to lose, to put it mildly. We haven't even counted the rest of the EU. All right, Russia may not be the main buyer of Chinese goods, but could it be the main seller? And no. The situation is very similar. The US sells the most to China, 2.5 times more than Russia. Shipments from Germany are twice larger, and Russia's sales are estimated as France plus the UK. So, I have a serious question for you. On what grounds should China see Russia as an equal partner? How can a country deal on equal terms with those who are 10 times their size? 10 times! It is as if Russia called Morocco its equal partner and reliable ally. Or an even clearer example, it is as normal as the friendship of a 30-year-old with a 9-year-old. Surely it's cool for a 9-year-old, they could brag about it. Imagine you go around trumpeting how adult you are because of your friend. Go trumpeting about it left and right. You are cool. But the question for a 30-year-old bloke is entirely different. You have to figure it out. Maybe he's not really friends with you and you made it all up to show off to your friends, or maybe he wants something from you. And we'd better slip away from this analogy so as not to provoke unpleasant thoughts and move on to what the man, China, really needs from Russia. I'm sure it will be no secret to you that China produces for the whole world, and Russia included, everything. Take a look at this beautifully refined infographic. A bunch of all sorts of electronics, textiles, metal products, toys. Each category is broken down into a bunch of others, so you see 100 different squares. But what does this all-round manufacturer want from Russia? Let's see. The largest square is our beloved crude oil, which is almost 50%. Then refined oil, coal, gas, iron ore, copper ore, and all that is 60.5% of the goods that we can offer to China. These are all raw materials practically in their pure form, exactly what we get out of the ground and what bears a proud label of the Russia's national wealth. Let's add copper products, nickel, timber, and platinum. And here we are already talking that about at least 72.4% of what Russia has to offer to China is what we are pumping out of the ground. All of our exports to China are comparable to US exports of $40.4 billion in electronics and equipment alone. Now imagine, you are China. Here are your contractors in front of you whom you are assessing. On the one hand, there is the US counterparty from whom you buy both products of intellectual activity such as integrated circuits, photolaboratory equipment, medical supplies, and more mundane goods such as soybeans and even a bit of crude oil. And on the other hand, you have the counterparty called Russia, from whom you buy mostly raw materials. Just look at it for the sake of clarity. All this is raw materials. What is your attitude towards the vendor of raw materials? Well, a natural one it is. I can get a favorable price for petrol from this counterparty. It's a hell of a good gas pump. It would also be nice to lease their territory for like 100 years. You know what the gag is? In the PR space, China and the US are at war, while China and Russia are best friends. In reality, China and the United States are actually good friends. And China's real attitude towards Russia is, well, moderate. It is important to understand that politics, or simply put, upholding one's own interests, is an obscure business. Although China and the US are each other's main economic partners, they are at the same time competing for world leadership status. Now, by the way, you should be able to understand the meaning of this statement. The US and China must not only guide their relations forward along the right track, but also shoulder their share of international responsibilities, whatever that means. So, they will not miss an opportunity to screw each other over, but they attempt doing so uncritically, so that all these squares do not disappear, or at least do not increase in value. They are not planning to go to war with each other. War is already obsolete. It's only profitable to go to war with less developed countries that you don't have any economic ties with. We've already mentioned several times about the high level of interdependence unseen before in the words of Alvin Toffler, a man of genius. A much higher level of interdependence. Work now required collective effort, division of labor, coordination, and integration of different activities. The success of work began to depend on the carefully planned joint behavior of thousands of widely dispersed around the globe people, many of whom hadn't seen each other in their lives. Without our oil, the Americans can produce all these integrated circuits. This is true. Hydrocarbons were an important asset 100 years ago, and they still are. But alongside them, all those microchips are becoming more important. Chip manufacturing is now perceived as a national security issue. The White House says just that. Protect US national security interests. And it plans to inject $52 billion into this field. Because there are chips in both your computers and high-precision weapons. A fat hint. Briefly, at this point it should be clear why in PR space China seems to be friends with Russia but then supports Ukraine. It seems to be friends with Russia but decides not to sell aircraft parts there. It seems to be friends with Russia but does not supply weapons, at least not openly. It seems to be friends with Russia but then abstains from voting in the UN Security Council on a draft resolution to end the Ukrainian crisis. By the way, those who have also abstained were the Arab Emirates and India. Already then, on the 25th of February, it was possible to see with whom trade would come to an abrupt halt, and with whom it was still possible for Russia to cooperate. Their cooperation pattern is the same as China's. So, on the one hand, China would like to continue using our hydrocarbons at an undervalued price, but on the other hand, it does not want to fall into this kind of isolation, simply because China is the world's main exporter, and the main importer is, I think you can guess just right, the US. And these two countries compete with each other, just like on Earth and also in space. As much as we don't want to mistake wishful thinking for reality, the latter is unperturbed. China is not a party to the crisis and does not want sanctions against Russia to affect itself. Sounds like something that I could have said, doesn't it? But here we go to the official website of the Chinese Foreign Ministry, find a transcript from the 14th of March, and here are the words of the Foreign Minister. And this is a normal position. Why should they be responsible for the actions of another country? Their job is to protect their own interests. Moreover, what's happening right now could play into the hands of our eastern neighbors. Watch this. There was news that China was considering buying cheapened Gazprom and Rusal, the largest natural gas and oil and aluminium companies. That's one. There was news that China is going to buy out Shell's stakes in Russia's biggest gas projects. That's two. Analysts estimate that Russia could hold $140 billion worth of Chinese bonds. That represents almost a quarter of foreign ownership in China's domestic bond market. Then, UnionPay plans to allow Russian banks to issue cards in its payment system. By the way, that's the whole point of the Chinese position reflected in this case. On the one hand, China is clearly in favor of connecting Russian banks to its payment system, on its own terms, of course. But, at the same time, it does not want to get screwed by sanctions from the West, so it refuses to cooperate with Sberbank, the largest Russian bank, and other sanctioned banks. It is like that everywhere. China's position now is to buy up what has fallen in price, to incorporate Russian processes such as financial ones into their systems, and if they also manage to buy out territory, somewhere like in the Baikal region, that would be just great. But if there are strong risks because of Western sanctions, then, we don't want it all that much. Don't get any foul idea, there is no conspiracy theory here. I'm not vilifying China at all right now. But its counterpart, which is Russia, has begun to tremble. So why not take advantage of the opportunity for their own sake? The position is quite adequate. But what does it mean for us, Russians? Let me tell you a funny thing. There was the news all over the media that Brent oil prices were rising.
А нефть дорожает. Она торгуется на уровне $99 за баррель.
Цена на нефть марки Brent сегодня превысила $100 за баррель.
Стоимость фьючерса на нефть марки Brent выросла на 5,83% до $111,09 за баррель.
Нефть дорожает. Цена на топливо марки Brent поднялась до $139.
And a whole bunch of Russians were like, wow, oil prices are rising, so it's good for Russia. But as of the 24th of February, we have a new reality. Watch this. You probably didn't know, but Russia does not actually sell Brent oil. It sells Urals oil, which is kind of equivalent to Brent. The Urals has always been a bit cheaper. Here is a graph for a better understanding. The discount is like $2. But here comes the 24th of February, and the discount becomes enormous. $35, a third of its price, roughly speaking. Just imagine, the physical properties of the Urals have not changed in any way. The only thing that has changed is the attitude towards Russia. Now those who still buy it are purchasing it with wild discounts because it is essentially the same Brent, just politically toxic, so to speak. Moving on, Russia needs buyers. Europe and the United States are all sour about it, but China will definitely purchase it, especially at a discount. Why wouldn't it, buying oil at 70 when it originally costs 100? We all love discounts in the shops, don't we? India has played well too. Because they are for us, Russians. Let's forget all this, for us against us. Such slogans only lead us astray. India is smart because it has bought 40 million barrels of oil from Russia since the war began. So what, you might ask? Is 40 million barrels a lot or a little? By comparison, last year they bought only 16 million. Yes, 16 million barrels for the whole year. So in 2 months of war, they bought oil 2.5 years ahead. Do you see where this is going? India is stockpiling oil, after which it will have a greater opportunity to pressurize Russia or smoothly transition from us to another seller. That's not all. So India has stocked the oil up and then says, well, that's not much of a discount for us, make it bigger. We want the oil under $70. Though we do not know for what price China is buying stuff in reality and in what quantities, it turns out that the so-called allies can dictate their terms now because they know Russia is dependent on them. There are so many simultaneous processes going on right now, and it's hard to say who screwed who exactly. China is buying at cheap what it can without incurring the wrath of the West. Russia is kind of in profit as well, just because it makes Russia keep going. Moreover, because of high energy prices, we make super profits, which is good, but only for the short term. The longer this situation lasts, the more Russia will sink into dependence on China, and even India, the more they will have leverage on Russia and demand an even bigger discount. And later, maybe something else. As a result, Russia will increasingly lose that sovereignty. It will increasingly have to make compromises that will take Russia's interests into account less and less every month. I would like to believe that what is happening will help to accumulate domestic resources so that we can create our own Iran. But other states have deployed entire programs even against this, which we will talk about some other time.